We're in a teaching series where we've been walking through the latter part of Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, his first letter called 1 Corinthians. And today I'm going to back up a bit and revisit some verses that Keith really helpfully preached on a few weeks ago, because I think they contain something that's going to equip us and help us on a day like today, which is Father's Day. In the words of Ron Swanson, Father's Day is a day invented by Hallmark to sell cards. Any Parks and Rec fans out there will get that. And we don't tend to take our lead from Clinton cards or from national holidays about what we preach on. We won't be preaching a sermon on National Smile Week or a National Picnic Day, although National British Wine Celebration does sound like a day worth preaching into. But I did want to speak about fatherhood today. I hope that's okay. I want to encourage particularly the men in the church and those of us who are dads as well, to encourage you. I want to pray with you, and I want us as a community to support you. I hope you don't mind this focus on them today. Now, we're familiar, I think, as people with the phrase that psychologists coined father hunger. And we're familiar as well with the longing that each of us have, I think, for an ultimate father figure. And God, whilst not being male, he is spirit. He's not male, but he does speak of himself and reveal himself to us in masculine terms. He is primarily father. There are attributes, of course, a couple of times in the Bible where he identifies with the maternal instincts in us, but he is predominantly father, son, not daughter, husband, not wife. The people of God are the bride of Christ, the wife of God. But God himself is our husband. And I think, therefore, that men have a particular responsibility in the way that we live to image and present God to our families and give children a window into God because of the fact that we are fathers. So a burden and a responsibility and a privilege that I think is intrinsically there in us as fathers. The psychologist Paul Vitz says that where fatherlessness increases in a society, atheism does as well. And conversely, more positively, men, in the way that they live when living positively, are able to make familiar and secure a relationship with God, make something like that easier for our children, simply by virtue, I think, of living well and of pointing people to God. So that's a strong opening gambit in the first few minutes of my talk. And I'm aware in speaking about something like this and on a subject like this, I'm touching on something quite contentious and problematic for some of us, painful for many of us, no doubt. So I am asking for your grace, and where these are just opinions of mine, I hope they fall to the ground. But if they are things that God's Spirit's on, that are confirmed in his word, I ask and hope that we as a church can receive some of these things. Now later on today, we're going to be, as been mentioned, we're going to be baptizing Loken as a follower of Jesus. And in doing so, she is doing something that Jesus himself did. She will enter the water, be lowered down into the water, and then sometime later will resurface from the water. And when Jesus was baptized in a similar manner, went into the water and came up out of it, at Jesus' baptism, the Gospels record for us that the heavens were parted in some manner, and a voice boomed and spoke, and that voice said, "This is my beloved Son." It's God the Father speaking, said, "This is my beloved Son, with him I am well pleased." God the Father speaks. The first words that the Father speaks in Jesus' public ministry are words of public approval and affirmation, as well as words that create and bear witness to his identity. hearing the Father say, "This is my Son," left Jesus in no doubt about who he was. And as Loken resurfaces from baptism waters, she too will resurface with a new identity. She's Christian, follower of Christ, with a new name, beloved daughter of the Father on Father's Day. And actually, just as Adam in Eden named the animals, and so in naming them, brought categories of identity to bear in the world, so the Father's speech and a Father's speech in our lives has a big impact on us in the way that it shapes our identities and often our destinies. Dads enable sons and daughters to live within an identity of being beloved. And that's our encouragement today. Now, today's sermon, though, will feel a little bit like a football match. It's going to be a game of two halves. We're going to spend the first half looking at the need for those words of beloved spoken from fathers in a society like this. And then we're going to look at the responsibility on fathers to lead their sons and daughters in a path of love towards the world so they can live love. That's what we're going to talk about. Before I read from the Bible, though, I do want to open our eyes a bit in order to hopefully engender levels of compassion and awareness in us as a church towards some of the challenges I think that are facing sons and daughters and men in our society. Then the second half of the message, we're going to encourage men and call out some good things in them. And just to say, anything I'm sharing today isn't really just opinion. I've got several books here that if anyone is interested in afterwards, there's a few Christian books, excellent book, Father Hunger by Douglas Wilson, I'd really recommend, and then some sociology books. Again, this one's, if you're interested at all in anything I'm sharing today, The Boy Crisis is really worth looking at, lifting the lid on some of the challenges. This is a wonderful testimony of Governor B, Isaac Bourque, about his loss of his own father and his search for purpose. And then this book here as well, which is slightly more controversial, so I'll put that at the back. But 5 Promises of Male Initiation. But they're there if you're interested. I just wanted to kind of caveat a lot of this. I also just want to give a couple of quick more caveats. It was like, get on with it. We're not that bothered. But I want to just lay some foundations here. I know that today's a painful day for many. I lost my own father when I was 26, just 3 months after the birth of my first son. So I know the pain of days like today for some of you. As a church in recent years, we've lost some really good men who the Lord's taken to himself far earlier than we would like, and it's worth acknowledging that. We're grateful to God for the men in this life that we've lost in recent years. They're not forgotten. I also just want to add one more caveat. As we talk about the value and the need for dads, I don't want to overlook or in any way be seen to be taking away from the mammoth effort that so many of the wonderful soul parents put in this church. What often single mums do and called to do is to play the part of both mum and dad, and it's, as I said, a mammoth task, and I want to acknowledge, salute, applaud, encourage you, and want you to know that we're praying for you, and if there's ever anything we can do to help in that way as well, then that is our heart and desire. So I don't want anything I'm saying to be heard to dishonor any of that valuable work that goes on, which I know it could easily sound like that sometimes. But here we go. 1 Corinthians. Here we go. 1 Corinthians, end of verse chapter 12. I'm going to read chapter 13 for us. You ready? Yes. Here we go. Great. Paul says, "And I will show you a still more excellent way. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I'm a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have prophetic powers and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so as to remove mountains but I have not love, I'm nothing. If I give away all that I have, and if I deliver my body up to be burned but I have not love, I'm gain nothing. Love is patient, love is kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. As for prophecies, they will pass away. As for tongues, they will cease. As for knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when the perfect comes, the partial will pass away. When I was like a child, when I became a man, I gave up childish ways. For now we see in a mirror dimly, but then face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. So now faith, hope, and love abide in these three, but the greatest of these is love. This is God's word. Beloved, the Father speaks over Jesus, and we want Loken to hear spoken at her baptism. But before we talk about the way of adulthood and manhood of love, I want us to talk about and convince you that there is a need for sons and daughters to be told that they are beloved first, they are accepted. And that is something that fewer and fewer people in society today are hearing spoken over them by fathers in particular. The author Warren Farrell in The Boy Crisis, he says that dads, like mums, air and water, are essential to our lives. But we've tried to live without dads. We haven't tried to live without mums, air or water. As a society, we're living through a time where almost half of all children born in the UK today will be raised in homes where dad isn't around. And there's no war to blame for that, as has been the case in many times in human history. In 2007, UNICEF said that father absence is the greatest social issue of our time. It has a huge impact. It's having a huge impact on society. I would argue that our children, particularly our boys, are suffering more than we realize from the effects of perhaps not just dad's deprivation, but also increasingly dad's demonization or male demonization. Through the messages in our media, a man is regularly told that he is either entitled, predatory, overpaid, or a clown, or sometimes all four. I recently saw an advert that the Scottish Police Department put out on sexual harassment. And the main message of the video was, "Look in the mirror, man. What do you see? A potential sexual predator." And the main message was, "Men, stop it." Which, if I'm honest, is often the message I've heard as a man growing and getting saved in the church and growing up, going to church and hearing messages for men. Often I've sat there and the main message is, "Men, stop it." And to be fair, there's a lot that men need to be told to stop. But that isn't necessarily the way that we're going to heal men's hearts and change society. When a boy is raised in a home or a society where he's regularly hearing negative comments made about masculinity or about his dad or about men, I think it's very easy for him to therefore look in the mirror and wonder about his own destiny. Is that what I've got to look forward to? Am I a villain? Am I to be blamed? Now, it's true that men occupy many of the highest paid jobs in society. But they also occupy many of the lowest paid and most dangerous and most poorest positions in society too. Men are often found at margins in societies. In England today, there are approximately 98,000 prisoners, and 96% of them are male. And 76% of those prisoners grew up with some level of dad deprivation. By the way, I'm not in any of this wanting to be naive or sound at all precious. I am aware that the female lived experience is far from easy. I'm not hereby saying men are really, you should feel sorry, we're the victims in society. I'm not doing that. In the past decades, we've become more and more helpfully and appropriately aware of the struggle of women in society. I'm trying to say is that men aren't necessarily or simply privileged kings. What I'm really trying to say is that men are suffering too. And on a day like today, it's important to, I think, open our eyes a little to some of that. Warren Farrell again helpfully says that in the battle of the sexes, which, by the way, we should never think of the relationship between men and women as being a battle. It's completely counterintuitive or counterproductive to anything that we want in family life. But in the battle of the sexes, if one sex wins, both sexes lose. So the goal in anything isn't for one sex, man or woman, to win over the other, but for both to be equally heard, honored, loved, valued. And we want to be, and hopefully are, a church that has a culture where men and women are honored equally in dignity, worth, value, gift, honor, competency before God. We believe that, and hopefully we live that out. Men, however, die in the workplace more often than women. They take higher risk jobs, and they often take jobs that take them away from their families. A man learns early in life that he serves his family best by being away from his family to work antisocial jobs, often to provide for the family. Men are more often than not, men are victims of assault and are expected to die or do their duty in war simply because they're men, and are often vilified or insulted if they show any reluctance to do that, often, in history at least, by women in society. Of the top 15 leading causes of death, heart disease, cancers, accidents, that sort of thing, men are more likely to die of 14 of them, the exception being Alzheimer's. The life expectancy for men is on average 5 years less than it is for women. And it isn't because of some benign biological factor as people used to believe. In the 1920s, that life expectancy gap between male and female was only 1 year. Now it's 5 years, showing it's not purely biological, it's often nurture, culture, society as well. In fact, boys and men under the age of 50 are twice as likely to die than girls and women of the same age, which is the worst it's been, I'm told, since World War II. And tragically, one of the main ways that men die is through suicide. Men considered worth less by society consider themselves increasingly worthless. And as many men died in recent years from suicide as died throughout the entirety of the AIDS crisis. And in 2015, in 1 year alone, more British men died from suicide than all soldiers died in all conflicts since the end of World War II. And suicide accounts for 3 times as many deaths per year as car accidents do. And what about our boys? Well, in every one of the world's 63 most developed nations, boys are falling behind girls in education and in life expectancy and quality of life expectations. Boys or men are much more likely to become addicted to video games, to porn, to drugs, to alcohol, and are also more likely to take dangerous risks with their lives in order to live up to the expectations of others. In the United States, 1 in 10 children are diagnosed with ADHD in recent years, and twice as many boys are diagnosed with the condition than girls. Going back to education, in the UK, not only do boys score less in reading and writing, but boys' IQs have dropped by 15 points since the 1980s, and one factor for that is the increasing rates of fatherlessness. I'm aware of a primary school class in Seaford, in which out of the 10 boys in the class, only 3 of them have dads at home. And that wouldn't be an untypical example anymore. I also understand from a local family worker that the majority of cases that cause challenges involve absent fathers. Another fact is that for every 1% increase in fatherlessness in a society, we can expect a 3% increase in youth violence, because hurting boys hurt others. Hurting men hurt others. So as I threw out the stat and said that more men are victims of assault than women, a fair response would be, yes, but they are men doing the assaulting. Nevertheless, the hurt men hurt men. So the need to care for and love our men and our dads, I think, is significant. So what do dads do and what do dads bring as parents? Well, actually, I'm not going to talk about it now, but if you wanted, there's a handout at the back with some of the over 30 different ways that they've recognized the dads and men values that they add to families that are just interesting, worth you to look at. So as children, we need to be told and hear that we are beloved, that we are accepted, that we are loved. Having been told that we're beloved and loved, then we can be trained to be loving towards others. But the challenge is that this first half, being told that we're beloved, is happening less and less. And so problems related to fatherlessness and father hunger are increasing. So that's the end of the first half. It's half time. We're 2-0 down. That's how it feels. Feels a bit sober, if I'm honest. That's hopefully the contentious and slightly problematic and controversial part out of the way. But let's come to the second half. Because Jesus heard the Father say, "Beloved, well pleased." And we need our boys and our men to hear this as well. But as we know, our goal isn't to just affirm and approve people, but to then train them to go out, train men, train boys to go out and to love and serve others. John Tyson, who's an American pastor, has recently written a book called The Intentional Father, which is aimed at helping men raise sons and daughters of courage and character. From September, I'm going to be starting a group for any men and dads who, for any of you for whom this is particularly resonating. We have got several of these books available. You can grab one for free on the tables at the back as you leave. But if you're interested, look out for that, because from September, we're going to be running a course just looking at the things that John Tyson talks about, helping prepare our boys for manhood. Now imagine a farmer walking down a country lane, and he comes across another farmer who is repairing a wall with his sons, and they're doing a terrible job, and it's taking a long time. And the first farmer says to the second father, "What are you doing, man? Why are you letting them help? It's going to take you twice as long." To which the second farmer replies, "Oh no, but you're mistaken. You think I'm repairing a wall. I'm not. I'm raising my sons." And as a church community and as men, we need to give more and more attention and effort to raising our sons and boys and helping us to do that, I believe. And we're going to come to the Bible, because I think nestled in 1 Corinthians 13 is a verse that's often, or a phrase that's often overlooked, that I want to draw some attention to. Paul describes the journey from being a child to being a man. When I was a child, he says, I reasoned like a child, I thought like a child. When I became a man, I put childish ways behind me. What are those childish ways that he put behind him that Paul left to move on to when he became an adult, therefore giving us a pattern for what we as a church and as men need to try to help our boys and daughters, sons and daughters do in becoming adults? What does he say? Well, this letter was written to a group of people, a church, who were competing with one another, arguing with one another, not sharing their food with one another, humiliating one another, mistreating one another, behaving, in short, like spoilt kids. So maturity looks like, well, for the Apostle Paul, maturity moving to adulthood looks like shunning the instincts that make us selfish and self-centered. Becoming an adult means sacrificial, other-centered service. In a word, love. But love is not, love. Love is gritty, dirty, hard, on your knees, serving week in, week out. So I love it when I see Jason in particular, I've noticed in recent months. Sorry, Jason, two weeks in a row I've embarrassed you. With his son, training him on just serving in the PA desk. It's lovely. A father helping his son realize this is what church is. It's serving. It's love. That's what it looks like. That's what maturity looks like. We need to convince our sons and daughters that they are beloved, and we then need to show them how that enables them to love. By the way, just as a little sidebar, when I talk about fathers, I don't mean just those of us who have young children at home. I think all adult men are included in this. In fact, Simon Howard recently gave me a brilliant book I've just finished by a social scientist called Arthur Brooks, who points out that the part of your brain that is best suited for mentoring, coaching, helping others, the part of that brain peaks in your 60s, which means the young men in the church are worse equipped to be good fathers to their children than the older men are, which means this is a message for the church, not for young men. Because the young men are going, I have no idea what to do with this, and I wish I had some older men who could help me, not just with this, but with this, with me, with help. And to be a community where older men help and serve and love, mentoring, coaching, encouraging younger men, challenging them, leading them is crucial to the health of the church. Okay? It needs to be said and stressed and underlined and repeated week in, week out. We need you, older men. In 1 Corinthians, Paul describes the typical ways that sons and daughters, and probably just anyone, sons and daughters think of greatness. He says, if I speak in tongues of men and angels, if I have prophetic powers, if I understand all mysteries, if I have all knowledge, if I have all faith enough to move mountains, if I give away everything I have, I offer my body over, if I do all of those things, what's he describing here? He's saying if I have celebrity status, I can speak in tongues and prophesy, I'm a wonder worker. If I have intellectual prestige, I understand mysteries and knowledge. If I have spiritual authority, I can command mountains where to go. If I'm a very virtuous man, I give everything away that I have. I'm an activist in society helping people. Or if I have heroic status, I'm a martyr. I lay my life down. I fight for others in battle. All of these traditional, typical ways that people aspire to greatness, celebrity status, into becoming a YouTuber, becoming a miracle worker, becoming a guru, becoming an activist or an intellectual, a lecturer, a consultant or a soldier. These typical ways that men aspire to greatness. Paul says, if I have all of those things, but I do not live a life of other-centered sacrificial service, I'm nothing. I haven't got anything. We are drawn to seek security and comfort in those things. It's easy. If I work hard, I can get those things. And those things will bring me greatness and prestige and legacy. I'll become important because I'll be famous or I'll be clever or people will think I'm amazing. They'll write books about me. If I've got all of that, they'll tear down my statues in 100 years' time if I don't have love. Paul says, I'm an empty, pointless noise that no one remembers after I've gone. So you can do all sorts of wonderful things and still be a blight to your society. You can find worldly success and still end up alienated and unimpressive in the end. When Paul says these three things remain, faith, hope, and love, what's he saying? He's saying this is where legacy is left. Not in those things, but in a life lived in loving service of others. Incidentally, this is also how the fires of toxic masculinity are put out, with a big enough purpose that occupies enough of our lives to act in non-destructive but positive ways like love. And so a father's role, I believe, isn't necessarily to decide what his son or daughter does, but rather to be concerned with the way their sons and daughters do those things. A father should teach them to pursue paths that lead to strengthening and the building up of others, rather than simply using what they have, their privilege, we might say, to express themselves or to feed their own selfish desires. Greatness looks like service and love of others. That was Jesus' model in the Gospels. It's Paul's model in 1 Corinthians to the church. It's the same. Men, you're drawn to greatness. You want greatness. That's a good goal. Aspire for a greatness that looks like this. Richard Rule writes in his book, Adam's Return, that men have always needed help in transitioning from boys to manhood. And every society in human history have had clear paths of initiation from boyhood into manhood. Every society except the modern West. For whatever reason, women in history, girls have not had or needed necessarily a specific initiation into womanhood. There's reasons for this. But men, boys do. And the 5 lessons that Rawls draws out in his book that are always formed a part of initiating into manhood are these. Life is hard. You are not important. Your life is not about you. And 2 others. If you want to know them, you have to come in September to the group. But those first 3, life is hard, you are not important, and your life is not about you, it's basically what Paul's saying here. Adulthood looks like love. Men, teach your sons that life is hard, that you're not important, and that your life is not about you. And the way that happens is in a community of men teaching boys often those lessons implicitly and explicitly. So Paul says to the church, put these childish ways behind you of saying me, feed me, love me, serve me. I'm the king. I have privilege, I have strength. Put those childish ways behind you and learn to be good at being a man. You are a man by virtue of your sex, by virtue of your birth. There's nothing you have to do to become a man. This is not to become a man, you must eat red meat, drive a truck, and shoot a gun. No, I love Downton Abbey and candles and a bubble bath, and I'm still a man. Still a man. Aren't I? Yes. This is not about narrow gender stereotypes. You are a man. The way you can be good at being a man is learning to love and serve others. That's what the Apostle Paul says about himself, moving from childhood to adulthood. I think that's how, as dads, we need to, some of the things that I had on my heart that I wanted to impress upon us as dads, that we need to do two things. We need to speak words of beloved acceptance, affirmation to our children, to our sons and daughters, to encourage them. But the goal isn't that they just feel loved and nurtured. The goal is that they then get sent to love and serve and offer themselves in service to others, to act in a loving way. And the church ought to be a community that helps one another move along this path towards maturity. It's a big task that we have ahead in a society like this. The church needs to be a city set on a hill that cannot be hidden, the light of the world, as Jesus said, because we recognize it takes a church to raise a child, and it takes a community to help men and women flourish in their fullness. Individualism runs out. We're not isolated individuals. We're part of a people. Big task ahead, high stakes. A few years after my dad died, I took a picture that he'd drawn for me before he died, and I took the back off it. And he'd written some words, a note to me on the back, and he just said, "To Jez, a son to be proud of." And those words, a son to be proud of, hit my heart. It was as though he was speaking to me in the present tense. He was in the room. And in that moment, I heard a fresh wave of affirmation and acceptance, beloved, loved by my Father. But he'd also trained me enough to say, and the way you live that out, son, and be a man, a son to be proud of, is you love your wife and you serve her and your children. And I think the Lord wants to speak that to the men in this room. He wants you to know that you're loved sons. You haven't got to do anything to earn the Father's approval. But then upon hearing it, he wants to send you out and commission you afresh. Sons and dads, I want you to see how Jesus has loved you. The Apostle Paul said of himself elsewhere, "I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself up for me." Knowing you're loved by the Son of God, who is the image and epitome of manhood, the one who had everything, had all privilege and power in his grasp, and he used it not to feed his own desires, but to serve the world and offer himself to others. That Jesus loves you and wants you to know that he's for you and he's with you, and it's his love in you that's going to propel you to do all that he's called you to do.